All right. Good evening, everybody, to Facebook family, to those who are watching us by Zoom. We greet you this evening. Thank you for coming and being a part of Let's Talk About It. Tonight, we have our guest with us tonight, Attorney Michael Daniels. He's here with us tonight to help us with some legal questions, especially with what we're going through right now in our nation, dealing with police brutality, everything that we're seeing, some of these unjust laws. So we're happy to have Mike with us tonight. So I'm going to ask Mike if you would introduce yourself, and then we'll get right into this.
All right, Bishop Jones, thank you for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the discussion. As you mentioned to the visitors, my name is Michael Daniels. I'm an attorney in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Law is actually my second career. I was a software engineer prior to this, but in my consulting, I found that I really didn't have the ability to help people the way that I wanted to, and I realized that a law degree was necessary. So at age 44, I went back to law school and received my JD as well as a master's in tax law. And so now I'm finding that that is a good combination to be able to empower our community and kind of help us get to where we really want to go.
Okay, excellent. So we'll get right into some of the questions that I have tonight. Explain to us the importance of why it's good to have an attorney.
Right. I will tell you just by way of an example that as we were talking about before in our initial conversation, the legal system really isn't fair, but it's not fair for the reasons that we think. It's really more that the law is a very technical practice. And there are a lot of rules and regulations and procedures that if you don't know, you really can't follow. So great example, I was in a hearing on Friday and I was going up against a person who did not have an attorney. And the very first thing he said to the judge was, well, I need a continuance because I haven't had a chance to get an attorney. And this was a civil case, so there is no right to an attorney. And the judge was kind of like, so what? You know, you knew this was coming. You should have gotten an attorney. And so I was able to make arguments because I'm skilled in that he couldn't handle. And as a result, he immediately lost. And I believe my client's case was just, but there are just little things that you just have to know. And if you don't have a skilled advocate, you can have a great case, but lose on technicalities and lose on procedural bases that you just have to be aware of.
And regardless of what it might be, whether it's for a traffic violation or anything, it's if you got to go to court and your case is pending whether you going to continue to drive with your license or whether you might go to jail, even though you think you may have a strong case, it's important to take a skilled attorney in to allow them to talk for you instead of you talking for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned traffic cases. I had a traffic case with a gentleman who asked me to come in and represent him. And because I'm an attorney, I was able to speak to the prosecutor ahead of the case. And I found out the prosecutor wasn't prepared on one of the charges, so that charge was immediately dropped. And just because of what I know about the system, I was able to take a potential jail time sentence and get it reduced to a $500 fine. And so, those are the types of things that when attorneys speak to each other, they're able to work out just because we know the language and we know the procedures and the rules.
Will a judge mostly rule for an attorney more so than he would if a person is there without an attorney, regardless if your case might even be weak and you still got an attorney?
No, judges tend to rule on procedural grounds and based on the law. So another example, I had a case where I was working against a woman who did not have an attorney. I don't know why she didn't. But when we got into the courtroom, the very first thing the judge said to her was, "Are you an attorney?" And she said, "No." He said, "Do you have any legal training?" And she said, "No." He said, "So I need you to understand that Mr. Daniels is an attorney. He is skilled in advocacy. And if he makes an objection, you will stop talking so that I can address the objection and I can rule." He said, further, you need to understand that I'm not here to level the playing field. I'm here to try the case. And so at the end of the day, she had pieces of evidence that she wanted to bring in, but because I know the rules of evidence, I was able to keep them out, which basically destroyed her case. And that meant that my client won a very nice settlement.
Okay, all right. So let's get into some of the questions that was sent in. I'll read the first one.
Okay.
Here it is. If someone gets arrested while protesting, how would that affect their record? And could the arrest affect future jobs?
Yeah, anytime you have a criminal conviction, it can affect future jobs. I think the important thing to remember is that being out protesting in and of itself typically will not get you arrested. What gets you arrested is when the police come and say, you can't be in this particular spot and we need you to move. Or, there's some other grounds where a police officer is believing that he's giving you a lawful order and you don't obey it. If the police are walking through the streets and they've got their batons extended and they're in a line, they're trying to clear that area. And if you stand in the way, then you're obstructing their movements and their operations, and you can be arrested for that. Now, that said, you do have a First Amendment right to peacefully assemble and to protest and do all those other things, but you need to do that with wisdom. So as you get into these protests and as you're involved in these public gatherings, be aware of where you are and what's going on. And, while I'm not saying that you have to, just, cower before law enforcement, remember that they're doing a job as well. And so we need to understand what the rules are, what the parameters are that we can operate in, and then find a way to work with law enforcement to avoid the arrest altogether. Now, if you are arrested, understand that you do have a right to an attorney if you're in custody and being interrogated, or if you go to trial. So those are important things to remember. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying before, that having a great attorney, to speak for you can set it up such that the charges get dropped completely, and that doesn't affect your record. So it goes back to knowing what to say, when to say it, what not to say, and having an advocate there to speak on your behalf.
So let's say, for an example, for those who Black and brown, mm-hmm. that grew up in a poor neighborhood, live in the house of a single parent mother, mm-hmm. Income is very limited, and the child gets into some trouble, mm-hmm. some serious trouble. Mm-hmm. And let's just say the trouble that they've gotten in, they really didn't actually do it. Mm-hmm. Now they got to go to court. The mother is already working 2 jobs. Mm-hmm. So you do have something called court-appointed lawyers, right?
Right.
But if you got a serious charge pending on your head, then what's the best route to go? Because we do know that the jails are filled with so many Black and brown young men and young women, all because they couldn't afford an attorney. So what should you do in that case if you don't have the funds?
Right, absolutely. You're right. We have a lot of people that lose cases because they don't have an attorney or proper representation. I can appreciate the work that our public defenders do. One, it's a thankless job, and 2, they're not paid a lot to do it. The problem with having a public defender, in my opinion, is that they are very overworked and they are under a lot of pressure to close cases. And so sometimes they'll make a deal that, may not be ideal. So what you really want to do is, speak to an attorney. Most attorneys offer free consultations. So you can always get that second opinion. You can always reach out to someone else to get it. Now, most bar associations have legal defense funds set up that are separate from the court systems. So you can look up, for example, the Virginia State Bar, and there are legal resources available where attorneys are available at low and no cost to help you. So just because you get an opinion from one attorney doesn't mean that you have to go with that. We're all out here to help. And the idea is make sure that you talk to an attorney that you're comfortable with, that you believe is competent, and that you believe can help you through that situation. And then to backtrack just a little bit, if you're in a situation where you're arrested and you didn't do what you're being accused of, It's a very simple thing. It's you have a right to remain silent. Exercise that right. So I had a young man who was accused of stealing at a store. Um, when I finally talked to him, I found out that he really didn't do it. But because there was so much pressure from law enforcement at the time, he said, well, yeah, I stole these tennis shoes and I was going to sell them. Never had them in his possession, never touched them, but he felt such pressure to say something that he wound up being charged. And as a result, the public defender cut a deal, and now he's dealing with kind of a probationary situation after I stepped in to say, no, that's not how we're going to do this. So you really have to be careful about what you say and what you don't say. And if you're ever uncomfortable, you say, look, I need to talk to an attorney, or I need to get some more advice on this because I don't understand what you're saying to me. And that's one of the biggest problems is law enforcement sometimes will say things to find out whether you're telling the truth or to try and get you to confess to something ahead of time. And all of that stuff becomes admissible evidence against you. So we really need to speak to our attorneys. And if I can even say this, in my mind, the best thing that you can do is establish a relationship with an attorney before you need an attorney. Because when you get to know someone ahead of time, it makes it very easy to pick up the phone and call and say, I've got a problem, can you help me? As opposed to trying to weave through all the attorneys that are out there when you're in the midst of a struggle, when emotions and tensions and things like that are very high.
Now, I can tell you there's a possibility that we might have to do a part 2 because questions are coming.
Mm-hmm.
I have some, and I want to empower all of those who are watching. So let me give you an example. I watched a movie the other day, being that all this is going on with Black Lives Matter. Mm-hmm. They got so many stories on Black people being arrested. And I watched a movie called Crown Heights. Mm. And it was a gentleman in there that was, he was falsely accused. And so he was in prison. His friend was trying to get him out. So he obtained an attorney. And the attorney said, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to cop a plea. Go ahead and cop this plea, and the judge will give you probation. Mm-hmm. Now, make a long story short, the judge didn't give him probation. The judge gave him 20 years mm-hmm. in jail. And so he looked at the lady and like, I thought you said, so speak to us a little bit about that. Mm-hmm. Before, so if we get in situations, our children, our friends, our family members get in situations like that, the danger of copping a plea.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, there's an understanding between prosecutors and defense attorneys that you can set up a plea deal on really any charge. But the problem with that is that the court doesn't have to accept that plea deal. More often than not, they do, but they don't have to. A judge can look at the facts and circumstances and make a completely independent ruling and override any deal that you make. So, if you're innocent, remember this, that if you're accused of a crime, the prosecution has to prove their case. No one can just come in and say, well, we think he did it, and then you get sentenced. They have the burden of proving their case. And if you're innocent, then you probably have things that help to prove that you're innocent. The extreme example that I use is, if you were out, let's say you were out at a club and you didn't want anybody to know that you were at that club, but you're accused of a murder that happened while you're at that club. Best thing you can do is tell your attorney, look, I was at this club. I really don't want anybody to know it, but that's where I was, so I couldn't have committed the murder. And so we can't be afraid to admit that exculpatory evidence, based on reputation or anything like that. And that kind of goes to one of the questions that I saw earlier. That's why we have attorney-client privilege. Attorney-client privilege is based on the notion that we want to have open relationships between attorneys and clients, and my client should be able to tell me anything without fear. And so that's part of the reason that we want to start establishing those relationships with attorneys as soon as possible, rather than in the heat of the moment.
Okay, so earlier I asked you a question about if you're arrested while protesting. Here's another question that sort of comes close to that. Right. It says a lot of attorneys are helping protesters by offering their service pro bono. Mm-hmm. How can people find access to those attorneys?
Right. There are two things that come to mind, right off the top of my head. The the bar associations like bsb.org have access to those type of resources, and they are very well informed about who's helping with these type of these issues. You can also check with the American Bar Association. A lot of times they will have references for attorneys who are doing pro bono or low cost work to help with these, these types of issues. Surprisingly, there is a lot of support for protesters and whatnot going on right now. And that's one of those things that you take advantage of while it's happening, because maybe 3 weeks from now, it may not be there. We just don't know.
Okay. Next question is recording covered under the First Amendment?
Recording?
Yeah.
You mean like recording a police interaction?
Police interaction, even if you're out protesting and you see something going on and you record it, it may not be happening with you, but it's happening to someone close to you. Or if you get in a traffic stop and you want to turn on your phone and do Facebook Live just for the sake of being protected.
Wow. So I'm going to give you the good attorney answer on this. It depends. So recording in general, is protected, but not necessarily First Amendment. So let's look at it this way. If I'm at a protest and I'm recording what's going on in public, there's no real issue with that. Now, if I decide I want to sell those images, I could run into a problem with violating someone's privacy or their right to control their own personal information or something like that. So that's where you have to be careful. Most law enforcement agencies these days are saying, we don't have a problem being recorded because that helps us and it keeps us on the up and up. But one of the things that you really want to do is be careful about who you're recording, because if a person puts their hands and says, don't record me, then you shouldn't record them. That doesn't really apply to public officials as much in the execution of their job, but that's one of those things that we want to be cognizant of. It's just like if you're out somewhere and someone wants to take your picture, you may want to say to them, I don't want you to take my picture. And the polite thing to do is, if I'm taking the picture, then I won't take your picture. And in the same vein, I won't record you either.
So speaking of recording, let's say you're trying to acquire some truth. And you bring a person in and you got a video or camera stashed away, but you don't tell them. And you start asking these questions so you can get the truth. You don't want to tell them because you might spook them, or they won't be forthcoming. Is that legal or unlegal?
Again, it depends. And it also depends on the use of that.
Okay.
And here's the thing. Legality may not be a real big deal, because private recording in your own home or in a public setting, maybe not an issue. The bigger question is, will that evidence be admissible? And it may not be if you recorded them without their consent. So you may get a great confession on tape and go to court and say, hey, I want to enter this. And the judge say it's not admissible. They didn't know they were being recorded, or he may say it's not admissible because it's hearsay. So those are the types of things that you really start getting into the technicalities of law, and it just really depends, from time to time.
So let me back up just a bit. So make sure I heard you correctly. So if someone is recording you and you don't want them to record you, and you put your hand up and say stop, by law they have to stop.
They should stop.
Okay.
They may not, but they should. Especially because it's a question of what's going to be done with those images.
So if let's say if the images are going to be sent and sent around to a number of people, what's your right?
Yeah, at that point, you have a right to control your images and your privacy. And you should be able to say stop. And then if they continue to record and they distribute your images, then we have a civil suit. That's a completely different issue. Okay. It's, coin flip as to whether you win or not, but you can sue on those grounds. News media, knows this well, that if they're trying to record something and you say no, they know they should stop and not use that segment. I've actually had it happen to me coming out of a police house with my clients. The news media was standing there with cameras. I was like, no, and they never used the segment. So, they kind of understand it. And as private citizens, we should understand that as well.
Now, are the laws different depending on where you live?
Absolutely. State to state, it varies. So that's why I have to always say it depends. Virginia and Maryland are great examples of where the rules vary, from place to place. You cross the line into Maryland or into DC, the rules may be completely different. So you really have to know about what's going on in the jurisdiction that you're in. And that's why it's important to know attorneys who are licensed in those jurisdictions, because I'm licensed in Virginia. And while I may know DC law, I'm not authorized to practice there.
Okay. Okay. So based on what you know, Virginia, if in Virginia, if someone records you and you say, no, I don't want it recorded, and they still do it, under the law of Virginia, you have a civil case.
Yes, in Virginia, I believe you have a civil case, depending on the circumstances, but there should be a civil case there to protect your privacy. In an extreme case, we file an injunction that prohibits the use of those images and maybe even requires the destruction of those images.
Okay.
It just depends on the particular situation.
So when you say civil, can that person be sued for what they do?
Absolutely, yeah. And the difference between a civil case and a criminal case is a civil case is between private individuals and there are not criminal charges involved. So a civil suit says, I'm suing you for some wrong that you did to me, and I need the court to address that. A criminal case deals with the violation of some statute, and the government is the opposing party. And they are, pursuing the protection of the public good, if you will. So there are different types of suits and different ways to pursue those. Okay.
Next question. If you get stopped by an officer, do you have a right to call your attorney on the spot?
No, actually you don't, believe it or not.
Okay.
And here is where you have a right to an attorney. In Virginia, in particular, and most other jurisdictions, you have a constitutional right to an attorney when you have been placed in a custodial arrest, which means, for example, they put cuffs on you, put you in the back of the car, and you're in their custody and you are being interrogated, which means they're asking you questions about what you're being charged with. If one of those two things isn't true, so for example, if they're just asking you questions, you don't have a right to an attorney at that point. If they've just arrested you, but they're not asking you questions, you still don't have a right to an attorney. The way that you're protected is that you don't have to answer any questions. That's your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. So you can say to an officer, I don't want to answer any questions. And the officer should respect that. Now, here's kind of the twist to that. You have those rights. But if you're stopped on the side of the road and you're refusing to answer questions, you're refusing to kind of resolve the situation with the officer on the scene who has very broad discretion in how they handle a case, what do you think the outcome is going to be? So if the officer is saying, look, I'm just trying to clear up X, Y, and Z, and you're like, I'm not saying anything, then the officer is going to be kind of thinking, well, what's really going on? And that's when the dogs start coming to sniff around your car. And that's when they, start saying, well, I can take you in because I suspect X, Y, and Z. Sometimes it's easier just to cooperate and talk to the officer than to try and assert all of your rights. I'll give you a great example of when I had an interaction with a police officer. I was on the Beltway and I was driving my car as opposed to the SUV that my wife normally drove at the time. So, those two cars feel very different. And I looked in my rearview mirror and I saw these blue lights behind me. And I was going fast enough that I probably could have gone to jail. And honestly, I just didn't realize it. And so when the cop pulled me over in a plain vehicle, I could have said, well, I need an officer here in a marked car. I could have asserted that. But you know what I said to him? I said, you know what? I really didn't realize I was going that fast. I'm sorry, driving this car, my mistake. And he took my license and he looked at me. He said, where are you going so fast? And truthfully, I said, well, actually, I'm headed to Bible study over here in Maryland. I just really didn't realize how fast I was going. He said, Bible study, huh? I said, yeah. He took my license, looked at my license, looked at me, looked up at the sky. He said, look, I got to go to this training. If you would, just slow it down for me, sir. Enjoy your Bible study and let me go. Right. Now, imagine if I had said, well, I want a marked car here and I want your supervisor and I want all this other stuff. How do you think that interaction would have gone? So sometimes we can resolve things at a very low level without getting into, I know my rights and I know this. Because when you start playing hardball, you better be ready to play all the way. So, but that's just my take on it.
Okay, all right. So let's back the train up a little bit more.
Sure.
Another question came in about recording.
Mhm.
Question is, what if you're recording something that you know is wrong, such as burglary, someone treating someone improperly, or
Mhm.
such as a child being abused,
Mhm.
uh, of that nature?
Yeah, you record it as a third party, and there's a really good reason to do that. It's that if you witness, for example, a burglary, we'll take that example, and you're seeing that from your home, and you want to record that so that the police have kind of an idea of what was happening, that's a great thing. And it is far better, in my opinion, to do that than to go out and confront the person who's committing the crime and putting yourself in harm's way. Those types of things may be admissible in court. We'd have to see, but you can best believe that if you have that type of information, that the court systems and the prosecutors and the police are going to want it. And that's a very helpful thing to have. So great example, you know, when we look at the whole George Floyd situation that we just had,
Right.
it's really good that that young lady stood there and recorded that entire interaction. Bravo to her. The idea that you could stand there and watch somebody be harmed like that, but have the presence of mind to actually record it is helpful. It shines a light on a lot of things that are going on. And frankly, I just believe it doesn't matter if the victim is black, white, purple, green, or whatever. When there's wrongdoing going on, I think we should be active in it, and we should be active in calling those things out and make sure they're not happening, you know, over and over and over again.
Well, since we're here
Mhm.
with this subject,
Yeah.
with George Floyd,
Mhm.
why is it so hard, being what we've seen for years? Okay, for years, as Black and brown people, we've been saying these things have taken place.
Mhm.
So now we have technology and
Right.
we can record some of the stuff. Even after recording, and I think what made George Floyd situation turn the corner for the Black and brown and where we are right now, as a people in the United States and actually all across the world, because of how it was done. Now, we know that there have been many videos that have been recorded of people being shot while running from the police, and yet those guys get off. Why is it so hard to get a conviction?
Wow. You know, there's a lot of reasons that it's hard to get a conviction in those situations. And I'll say, you know, as I offer my opinion, there's a lot of different reasons. But one of the problems with convictions in these high profile cases is sometimes your jury pool is tainted, you know, because everybody's seen the information. And, you know, there becomes a question of, can this person get a fair trial? You know, is there prejudgment? All these other things. But the other thing that I think is a problem in trying to get convictions in these high profile cases is that everybody knows what happened. And unfortunately, as a prosecutor, remember I said they have to prove their case. And so as a prosecutor, if I'm not careful, I might say, well, you all know what happened. You saw the tape. You know this person's guilty. But at the end of the day, then they come back and the jury says, well, you had to show us this, 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 and this. And in law, we call it elements. You have to show us element 1 through 5. And all you did was show us a tape. You didn't explain to us how that tape related to elements 1 through 5, so we can't give you a conviction. And that gets into a position where a judge can literally take a case from a jury, it's called summary judgment, and say, prosecutor, you didn't prove your case. We saw it in the O.J. Simpson case. We saw literally, when I was watching it prior to being an attorney, I watched that case and I said, they haven't proved it. Doesn't matter whether I think he did it or not. They just didn't prove the case. You have to meet all of the elements. And that's why if you're a prosecutor, you have to be really careful prosecuting a case to make sure that you meet that standard of proof without any question, to make sure that every single element is addressed and that you don't leave any question in the mind of the jury. Because if you introduce reasonable doubt in a case like a murder case, it falls apart and you lose, and you can't retry the person after that because of our double jeopardy rules.
Okay. All right. We're gonna come back to um, that in a few minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask this question. Here's the question that came in. Explain what is a revocable trust will.
Okay, so those are actually two separate things. There's a will and there's a revocable trust.
Okay.
So those are all components of estate planning. A revocable trust is a trust that you set up where you put your assets into what we call a trust, and that those assets are then no longer really yours. They belong to the trust, and they are set there for the benefit of someone else. So a good example is I could take my house and I put it into a trust for my kids. And the idea is that when I pass, my children get the house, and they get it without having to go through probate. It passes to them immediately. Now, the idea behind a trust is that I put it in for them, but I get to continue to enjoy it during my lifetime. A revocable trust is one that I can change the terms of it while I'm alive. And so it differs from an irrevocable trust in that in an irrevocable trust, I can't change the terms. It's permanent and it can never be changed. Most of the estate planning that we do happens with a revocable trust because you never know what's going to happen down the road.
Right.
Now, there are some tax differences, and I won't get too far into them, but in general, look at it this way. If it's a revocable trust, then the tax burden remains with the person who's granting it. So in my example of having a house, I'm still liable for the property taxes. I'm still liable for paying the mortgage and all those other things. In an irrevocable trust, the person who is granted the property would then begin to pay the taxes. So my kids would have to pay the taxes in an irrevocable trust because they are considered the owners of it immediately. They're no longer just beneficiaries. So, you know, and with estate planning, it really is a very personal and customized thing. So if anybody wants additional information on that, I'm happy to talk to them offline about it.
Okay. All right. If you could put your information in the little box,
Mm-hmm.
we can do that at the end. So if anyone wants to contact you. Next question is, and I think is sort of relevant to the one that you just answered. Mm-hmm. It says, what is the process for preparing a living will, and what is an estimated cost?
Okay, so it depends on who drafts it. That's going to be the first thing, because different attorneys charge different amounts. So I'll speak to what I do. If a person wants to draft a living will or an advanced medical directive or what else do we call it? A power of attorney, healthcare power of attorney. The process that I go through is that the first thing I do is I sit down with you and I say, if something happens and you can't speak for yourself, who do you want to speak for you? Most people assume that it's going to be the spouse, but that may not be the right person. So the idea behind drafting that is to say, I want this person or this group of people to make a decision for me if I can't speak for myself. And we kind of go through figuring out who those people are. And then we determine the things that they can and can't say for you. So for example, it may be you get out and you get into a car accident and you're incapacitated. And you may have an objection to life-sustaining procedures, just being on a machine. You can say they're authorized to take me off that machine if they believe that I have no chance of recovery. And so the hospital will respect that. There are other things like, for example, what happens with my assets if I can't speak for myself? So, who's authorized to sign checks on my bank account or to pull money to pay for my medical expenses? Those things all get incorporated into a living will or advanced medical directive or a power of attorney. So the big process is, let's determine what you want to happen if you can't speak for yourself. So basically you're speaking now in the event that you can't speak later. Once we do that, we draw up the document and we get it notarized and go through all the formal proceedings. That can cost anywhere from, we'll say, $1,000 to a few $1,000s, depending on the complexity, depending on how much time is involved, and depending on the number of assets and decisions that need to be included in that document. So once again, very personal kind of service, but always happy to talk to somebody and give them more specific information and better pricing information.
Excellent. Let me shoot another question at you. and I'll use, just for the sake of just a hypothetical question. I have a will,
Mhm.
and I'm not going to include my wife in my will,
Mhm.
but I'm going to include some other people in it.
Mhm.
Now, say for an example, if something happens to me,
Mhm.
how much right or how much goes to the wife, even if, or the husband, even if they're not mentioned in the will?
Wow, you just asked a loaded question, Bishop, and this is in Virginia especially. In Virginia, you cannot exclude a spouse from your estate, believe it or not. Virginia has a law that we call augmented estate, which means if a spouse isn't mentioned in the will, they have a right to, I believe it's 1/3 of the estate automatically. So when we draft estate documents, we always make sure that we either get the spouse to waive those provisions, or the spouse is mentioned in some capacity to avoid that. Because the last thing that you want is to have the will challenged, and then it goes into a court proceeding and the estate gets diminished, just fighting those provisions.
Okay. Since this pandemic has happened and people have been quarantined in the house, I was reading an article the other day, domestic violence have shot through the roof.
Mm.
What do you do if you're in a situation and you're in the household with someone that's physically abusing you,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't have the assets, the money to retain a good lawyer to fight for you? What do you do?
Wow. In that circumstance, whether it's physical or mental abuse, one of the things that you can do is get in touch with the local magistrate, which is typically down at the courthouse or the sheriff's office, and you file a restraining order. It's just kind of the first step, and it's not very complicated. Most people can do it on their own, and the magistrates have personnel that can help you get through that process. If you can't retain an attorney, then that kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier about contacting the bar association, or really just contacting any attorney to get some direction as to where you can go to get some help if you need it. And so, like I said, bar association is a great place to get that help. Most of the courthouses that I've been in have flyers up that tell you how to get legal assistance if you don't have the assets, but those resources are there. The first thing to do, though, in that situation, secure your safety. And that's, by getting in touch with the sheriff, the police, the magistrate, and getting a restraining order.
So when you say secure your safety,
Mm-hmm.
Can you get a firearm?
Wow. Oh, excuse the pun. That's also a loaded question. But self-defense becomes a very sticky topic. That could go a lot of different ways. So now the question is, if you're in a situation and you're being physically abused and you go get a firearm, is that premeditated if you defend yourself, or is it, legitimate defense? Because the question that, if I'm prosecuting the case, that I'm going to ask is, well, you left to go get the firearm, assuming it wasn't in the house. Why'd you go back? So then it gets to be really sticky there. If for some reason there's a firearm in the home and you feel that your life is in danger, say there's an altercation and something happens, and in the process of that, a firearm is produced and it's used, there may be a case for self-defense. Every case is different. I certainly, in this forum, would not get into specific legal advice on that.
Okay.
That everything is different.
Different.
The idea is secure your safety by whatever means you need to, preferably in a way that involves law enforcement, so that things can be handled properly, and avoid the potential that you wind up in a court situation that you can't handle.
What's the average time of a restraining order?
I'm sorry, say that again.
What's the average time when someone have a restraining order against them? What's the average time that lasts? How long does that last?
It can go anywhere from a short period of time to indefinitely, depending on what it is that you're trying to get restrained. Every time you go in for a restraining order, in general, what happens is you have to say why you want this restraining order and for what purpose, and then kind of, what you want the court to do. or the magistrate to do. So if it's a domestic violence situation, you may get a restraining order up through the time of trial, or you could get a permanent restraining order, if it's extreme enough, where it says, this person is just completely out of control. I can't have them anywhere near me at any time. And the court may very well order that person is to stay away from you at all times. So it really depends.
Now, is it better to have an attorney to speak on your behalf for that, or should you try to go about it yourself?
I would always recommend having an attorney, if you're in court, to speak for you. Judges that I've dealt with tend to try and relax with pro se litigants or people who don't have attorneys, but they still have to follow the rules. Mm-hmm. So the worst situation is when you don't have an attorney and you assume the other person doesn't have an attorney, and then you walk into court and all of a sudden somebody stands up and says, "Hi, I'm Michael Daniels for the defendant." And then they hand you a document that says, "I'm their attorney." And you had no idea. Now you're sitting there without an attorney, fighting against an attorney. Always good to be proactive with that. As much as I hate to say it, I actually did that to somebody once. Walked into court, and that was the first time he knew that I was representing the person that, the case that was in the case against him. Mm-hmm. And I did it intentionally because there was a certain element of surprise that I needed for that particular case. So the strategic reason, there's nothing illegal about doing it, but I needed the shock value at that moment. And, that's one of those things that attorneys know that generally people who are not attorneys don't. So you got to be strategic in how you prosecute a case.
Gotcha. Next question. If a person is on Medicaid in Virginia and owns a residence, if they die, does the state have a right to recoup monies paid out? The resident is left to the children upon death.
Wow. That is a good question that I actually do not know the answer to, but I'd be happy to research it and get back to you.
Okay. All right. So let me ask this question here. Are there any tax advantages to acquiring assets in the name of a trust or LLC versus individually?
There are some advantages to doing things as an LLC because you're setting things up as a business. And as a business, there are things that you can deduct that you cannot deduct as an individual. So even if you don't do it as an LLC, you can do it as a sole proprietorship and still take advantage of some of the tax laws. The reason that I tend to recommend setting up a formal corporate entity in a lot of situations is because it separates your personal assets from the business assets. And when you have a sole proprietorship, you can't pass that sole proprietorship to anyone through a will, through a trust, or anything else. Great example that I've had to deal with is a family that owned a business, or the father owned the business as a sole proprietorship, passed away, and said, "I'm leaving my business to my kids." Well, the problem is that as a sole proprietorship, there is no more business when he dies. So then it creates this really weird legal situation where it's like, well, is he leaving the business assets to the kids, or is he leaving all of this to someone else? Because the terms in the will created a conflict. And so now we're still in litigation dealing with that. So setting up a separate legal entity, if he said, "I'm leaving my business," well, now there's a business to leave. And it creates a much cleaner effect. So with something like that, definitely talk to an attorney when you're setting it up on the front end, because it's important to do it correctly so that you avoid the problems on the back end.
Okay. What are the pros and cons of creating an LLC versus a corporation? And how do you select the right corporate structure?
Mm-hmm. Right. There are different advantages depending on what you're doing. Selecting the right structure is a process. So attorneys like me who do corporate work, we tend to have kind of a flow chart that we go through to help select the right entity. So for example, if you tell me that you're doing a tech startup and you're going to do an app and you want to have venture capital come in from big capital firms, then typically I'm going to tell you to go with a corporate structure like a corporation, because the law about corporations, especially Delaware corporations, is very consistent. And venture capitalists may want to operate in that particular realm. So we don't even consider partnerships or LLCs in those situations because we know what venture capitalists are looking for. If you tell me, look, I'm just doing a small business on the side and I just want to separate my personal assets from my business assets, then I'm probably going to tell you to go with an LLC because it's cheaper to set up. You have a lot of flexibility in how you manage it, how you distribute profits, and really how you operate. So those are things that we look at when we're determining the proper corporate structure. All of those things are dependent on the type of business you want to run, and sometimes it also depends on regulations. So there are some businesses that have to be corporations, or there's some contracts that require corporations as opposed to LLCs. We don't see that as much now because LLCs are becoming much more popular and accepted, but there are a lot of businesses that say, no, it has to be an Inc. or we won't deal with it.
Okay. If I have a major debt with the IRS,
Mm-hmm.
A big debt,
Mm-hmm.
how do I go about paying that off when I'm already struggling?
Mm-hmm.
I'm already working 2 jobs. I got bills on top of bills, and
Mm-hmm.
I got this major bill facing me with the IRS. And most people get really, really scared when it comes down to the IRS.
Mm-hmm.
What should they do, or how should they go about trying to pay that balance off?
They called me first.
Okay.
Seriously, well, there are 3 options that I can think of right off the top of my head. You can apply for an installment plan. If you have enough money coming in that you think you can pay it, you just need, a plan so that they leave you alone. You can apply for an installment plan. If for some reason you feel like I don't have enough money to pay this off, I'd like for them to consider a lower amount, you can do what's called an offer in compromise. And that's really based on a lot of formulas. It's a standard form. You fill in the information, the IRS will look at it and determine if they'll accept your offer or not. You can look at any number of scenarios. And sometimes what they'll say is, yeah, you clearly don't have enough money to pay it. We'll forgive the debt. The third option is bankruptcy, and look to either restructure or get the debt discharged. So those are all 3 different options that I can help with and kind of help explain depending on the individual circumstance. Tax is a very complicated and cumbersome area because the IRS penalties can be very heavy, and the IRS has the ability to basically seize your bank accounts with almost no notice. So those are things that we have to work with and work on. The most important thing is don't just let it sit and ignore it, because the longer it goes, the harder it is to deal with. You want to be proactive and get in there and really start talking to them, either directly or through an attorney to say, I want to resolve this, and have them work with you to resolve it as opposed to just ignoring it, hoping it will go away.
Okay. What steps can a person take to minimize tax liability?
Wow. It really depends on the type of tax liability that you have. If it's payroll, where you have a job where you are blessed to have a really large income, not a lot that you can do with that other than give to charity. Now, as you know, the 2017 tax law gave us a large standard deduction, which kind of took away our ability to itemize in a lot of ways. So you still have to be, I don't want to say creative because that's not the right word, but you have to figure out what's in the tax law that applies to you and then use those things to your advantage. So for example, if you have a business, you can offset, income against the business. If you're self-employed, there are a lot of deductions that you can take. If you are running a small business through a pass-through entity, there's what we call qualified business income deduction, which allows you to basically offset 20% of your income and take it tax-free. So, with the right circumstances, you can do that. Just a lot of different strategies depending on the individual that we can always look at and deal with.
Okay, so let's go back a minute. We probably have about 10 minutes with this, where we are with the protesting, trying to get laws changed. As an attorney, what would you tell us tonight, those who are listening and watching, what would you tell us that our best moves are as individuals, how to deal with what's going on with police brutality, a lot of the things that's happening in the street. What's our best move as Black and brown people? Yes, we're protesting, but what are some of the other things that we can do?
Right. I'm glad I'm glad that you phrased that the way that you did. What's our best move? And I think about chess as opposed to, other games. The idea is, yes, we protest and we bring awareness, but once we bring awareness, then we've got to have a plan to do something beyond that. And I think the biggest things that we can do is we need to look at being empowered in a number of different ways, starting with political empowerment. We can't just allow our elected officials to, just kind of pat us on the head and say, oh yeah, you should vote for me because, you should, we need to hold our politicians accountable. We need to say, what are you doing for our community? Because if you're not doing something for our community, if you're not representing us, then we need to find someone else. The next thing is economic empowerment. We need to figure out how to have our own businesses, how to set up our own communities that are self-sustaining and where we're bringing profit and money into our own homes as opposed to just spending it into other communities. I'm really thinking that's a big thing. And that will also take care of some of the issues in our school system. My wife will tell you in a heartbeat that the money that goes into schools is based on the tax revenue of that locality. And so if we can raise the incomes in our neighborhoods, then that means more money into our schools, which means better education for our young people, which puts us in a better position to be economically, politically, and socially empowered. And then the other thing I think is we need to understand how laws are made and how we can get things passed through Congress or through the legislature, and then hold these politicians accountable. We said, we want this law passed and it should happen. Now that means also that we have to be aware of what's going on. So it goes beyond the election. It's not just, well, we're going to vote for this person and hope they do what they say they were going to. We need to be looking at the legislative calendar and looking to see what things are happening in the state house, looking to see what laws are being passed and see if they're actually benefiting or hurting us. And beyond that, understanding how to take advantage of the laws on the books is a big thing. As a tax attorney, people say to me a lot of times, the 2017 Tax Act, the news media tells me it's going to be bad for the middle class. And my response is, it's good right now. And so what we need to do is, let's take advantage of it now. We can spend our time complaining, or we can spend our time taking advantage of the laws now and plan for the potential change in the future. And so when it changes, we're not surprised, and we just change our strategy then. But if we don't do those things and we're not prepared to take advantage of the changes, we put ourselves in a hole. So Wayne Gretzky said, they asked him, how is it that you're so successful on the ice? He said, most people skate to where the puck is. I skate to where the puck is going to be. Mm. So we have to be forward thinking enough to say, okay, 2017 Tax Act gives me this. All right, I'm going to use that. I'm going to start a business now because I've got 7 good years to get this business up and running. And if it changes in year 7, then I already know my strategy is going to be to change my structure this way. And if it doesn't change, then I keep operating the same way. If it does change, I've already planned for it. So in year 5, I'm making that transition just in case. So it's that forward thinking. It's the understanding of how to use the law as a tool, as opposed to being afraid of the law and just saying the laws are unfair. It's difficult because we a lot of times don't understand what's going on. And that goes back to education. And education isn't just going to school. It's being able to talk about the issues, being able to say, how do we use this to our advantage? And if it's not working to our advantage, how do we get it changed? I know it's a long answer, but.
No, that's good. I think we needed to hear that because a lot of us, while we are quarantined at home, we're trying to figure out, okay, what do I do? Mm-hmm. What do I do with my time in trying to get something changed or passed? I'm not a person who, let's just say you want to protest, but your health reasons mm-hmm. won't allow you, especially during this pandemic. So right. I can't get out and protest. So mm-hmm. what's my next best option?
Yeah, the next best thing is to start thinking about legislative change. And, start a letter writing campaign. Get in touch with your congressman or your representative or your senator and say, here are some things that I believe need to be changed. and get people to sign petitions or write letters. You can participate that way, and you don't have to leave your home to do that. These are
Okay.
things that you can do through social media. Get people aware of the next move. So because a few weeks from now, I suspect the protests are not going to be as heavy as they were over the last week or two. What do we do after we brought awareness to the situation? We can't just let it go away. We have to take that next step, which is getting the permanent change in the laws, in the attitudes, and in the mindsets of people that this affects.
Okay, one final question, and then I'll give you an opportunity to wrap it up and what you would say to all of us. And again, thank you for coming on tonight and sharing with us. I think this was great. I have a passion for human trafficking and sex trafficking.
Mm-hmm.
There is a case right now out in Wisconsin. Young lady who killed her trafficker. She murdered him. She's in jail right now. I want to do something to help.
Mm-hmm.
Now, from the little that I know, she already has an attorney. But what can those of us that want to help, that don't live in Wisconsin, what can we do to bring awareness or shine light on this case to get some other people to come in, maybe such as help with finances or anything? We got a lot of people out here with a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we bring some light to that situation?
Right. There's a lot of different things we do, so first of all, keeping awareness of it on social media, because, when we talked, I hadn't even heard about the case until we talked about it.
Right.
So, bringing some awareness to it the same way we do other things, getting it out on social media, getting people involved. There are a lot of things that we could do in terms of contributing to defense funds. So we talk to the attorney and say, if we want to help with the finances for this, I don't know an attorney on the planet who would say, no, I don't want you to send some money in, because litigation is extremely expensive. It's time consuming. And attorneys, a lot of times, I won't even say it that way. We have to eat too. So, if you want to contribute, that's a great thing. But what we want to do is make sure that we set it up so that the money goes to the right place.
Right.
Helping to collect information, or asking the attorney, is there anything that I can do, maybe even if it's just receiving letters and opening them and helping you sort through stuff, which is kind of a little sticky area because you have to be trained to do that stuff.
Right.
But, you ask the attorney, what can I do to help? How can I get you information that you need? What kind of support do you need? A lot of us as attorneys, we're in a high stress profession, and a lot of times we don't recognize that we need help until we really need it. So to have someone say, how can I help? Even if we don't ask for anything, it means a lot to know that someone is either out there wanting to help. And in my case, I will say, if I know that you're out there praying for me, that helps tremendously. Just find out what that individual needs, and then try and meet that need if you can, because it's different for everybody.
Right. And we know that social media is a powerful tool. Mm-hmm. So even if we don't have finances to be able to offer, we can use social media to bring light to this.
Absolutely. And one of the big things that we have seen lately is that people are using social media to promote things like GoFundMe accounts or things like that. So it may be one of those situations where I don't have money to contribute to it, but I might be able to get 20 people to contribute money to it.
Right.
And every little bit helps. And sometimes we think, all I've got is $5, but if you've got, 100 people giving $5, well, now you've gotten up to $500. You get 1,000 people giving a little bit, it really helps. And so if you consider that an attorney might charge $300 an hour, if I give $300, well, I just paid for an hour of his time. Mm-hmm. If I get 8 people to give $300, well, I've just paid for an entire day of his time. And that's important when you're dealing with a case, because attorneys will burn 8 to 10 hours a day dealing with litigation. And one of the big things in the back of our minds as solo practitioners is, okay, if I'm spending time on this, how do I get paid for that? If I'm spending time on this, am I getting paid for that? Because like I said, we all have to eat. So, every little bit helps.
Why is it so hard to get funding for human trafficking and sex trafficking? We
Well,
know there's a lot of hot spots here just in Northern Virginia area,
mhm.
but there's very little um, light being shown upon it. There's not a whole lot of people, officers working with it. What is the reason for that?
Yeah, I don't know what the exact reason is, but I would suspect that this is something that happens, for lack of a better term, under the cover of darkness. It's not something where you can walk down the street and just see people blatantly, trafficking or dealing in these issues. These networks are hidden. You have certain processes that you have to go through in the law to prosecute, and it's hard to make a case when you can't find somebody. So, these are things that when we start talking about awareness, maybe part of the campaign is to say, here's what you look for. If you see this happening, that's potentially a trafficking situation. Finding some hard markers that say, these are things that you can look for. And then the more eyes that we have on these situations, maybe that will bring some awareness and give us a better means to prosecuting these things and to hopefully putting an end to some of it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. I think this has been very helpful to all of those who've been watching tonight, who's been listening. I want you to close with whatever you'd like to say to those who are watching and listening. And then we will call it a night. And again, thank you so much. And I'll ask all of our audience, those who are on Zoom, those who are on Facebook, if you could show Michael some love and let him know how much you appreciate him coming on tonight and offering up this information, because it is my desire to empower us as a people. The scripture teaches us that my people perish because of lack of knowledge. And so the more knowledge that we have, the better off we can be. So if you can, New Life family, friends that's watching on Facebook, a shout out, a thanks, let him know so he can see it, so he'll know that what he shared with us tonight, it's appreciative.
Right. Yeah. And I think I'll just piggyback on what you said. Perishing for lack of knowledge is a very big thing. And there's a lot of different ways to get knowledge. Not everyone needs to go get a law degree to understand the law. That's why attorneys are here. It's far better, if you have a specific instance, to call somebody like me and say, hey, this is the problem I'm facing. Can you help me? That's why we're called attorneys and counselors at law. Our job is to counsel, to advise, to help people work through their issues. You shouldn't have to go get a law degree to work through a single problem. If it's your passion, great. Go get a law degree. In fact, if you want to attend law school, talk to me. I'm happy to explain the process of how that works and how you're admitted and all the things that you need to do to prepare for that. But in general, you can get the knowledge that you need by partnering with someone that has it. If you know someone that's in business, you talk to a business owner to find out how to start a business and what they've gone through. And I think that's one of those things that as a community, we don't do as well, is share knowledge amongst ourselves. And for that reason, Pastor, I thank you for setting this up. We'd love to do a part 2 if it's workable.
Okay. All right.
We'll go with that.
Can you put your information, how people can contact you, down in the box? Or you can either say it, whichever one is better for you, so we can get that information out to everyone.
Sure, I'll put it in the chat box, and I'll also go ahead and say it.
Okay.
So you can reach me. The best way to reach me is via email, because I don't tend to take phone calls during the day unless they're scheduled. So I'll put my email address in here in just a second. And for those who are listening, it's mdaniels. It's MDANIELS at MLDPLC.com. And you can go to my website and find information on how to contact me as well.
Excellent. Excellent. All right. I pray that everyone have enjoyed our Let's Talk About It tonight. I'll say to our audience, if there's a topic that you would like to hear, something that's pressing you would like to get some information on, please email us. The email will be in the chat box where you can see. Someone can put that in there for me. And if you have more questions, you didn't get a chance to ask your questions, or some questions come up during the course of the week, let me know, send me an email, and we'll reach back out to Michael and see if he has something open, and we'll come back and we'll do a part 2, because we want to empower as many as we can. So we won't walk in a spirit of ignorance, but we will walk in a spirit of awareness. So thank all of you again for participating. Michael, thank you once again. And if we could get that information put in New Life, where you send the email.
Yep.
Tiara, can you put that information in for me? Just so everyone can see it. If they have more questions, they didn't get a chance to get theirs or something come up, you can email us and we will look at it. And if there's enough questions, we'll bring Michael back again and let him continue to educate us in the law.
Mm-hmm.
All right. With that being said, thank you again, Michael. We'll be in touch. And there it is, info@nlcbc.org. You can reach me there. Any questions you have, any topics you would like to be heard, just send us an email and we'll do our best to bring it about. So again, good night, everybody. Thank you again for participating. Michael, thank you again, and we'll be talking soon.
All right. Thanks, Bishop. It's a pleasure.
All right.
All right.
Bye-bye.